Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us for this special question and answer session for National Science Week 2021. This year's theme for National Science Week is Food Different by Design, and today's event we will be looking at the chemistry of cooking with seafood in particular, and a special look at the Western Australian rock lobster. Hopefully you've been able to look at the worksheet for this session and started thinking of some of the questions you have for our special guests. And today we'll be receiving your questions via Mentimeter. To send your questions to the speakers, just go to menti.com and type in the code 9005 5764. 9005 5764. You'll see it up the top of the screen as well. Today we are joined by Analiese Gregory, who lives in beautiful Tasmania. Analiese is a chef who dives, fishes, hunts and forages for a lot of the ingredients that she cooks with. Analiese can answer all of your questions about the chemistry of cooking with lobsters and other seafood. Hi, Analiese.
Hi there.
We are also joined by Simon de Lestang from Western Australia. Simon is the Principal Research Scientist at the Western Australian Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development, and he knows all about rock lobsters and other crustaceans, so where they live, what their behaviours are, and also how we can catch them. Hi, Simon. Now, I'll hand you over to our host. She's a science communicator with a background in marine biology and a presenter and a model, Laura Wells. Hi, Laura.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Alexis. Well, National Science Week is so much fun, and I'm so glad that I can be here with you all to talk about rock lobsters. Lobsters are so important to a lot of our ecosystems in Australia, and we need to think about them in terms of conservation, how we eat them, how we catch them, and what they do to the environment, how they live in our environment, and how they give back to us. Our first thought starter today will be for Simon. Now, I just want to make sure that Simon is here to answer our questions for us. Are you there, Simon?
Yep, all good. I've got it working now.
Excellent. Good to hear from you. So rock lobsters are typically caught using baited pots or traps, and commercial lobster pots are fitted with specially designed sea line excluder devices or sleds. And that means they stop the young juvenile sea lions from getting stuck inside those lobster pots when they're trying to steal a lobster out of them. Now, Simon, can you tell us how lobsters are caught in Western Australia?
Okay, thanks for the question, Laura. In the commercial fishery, that they can only be caught by pots, but in our recreational and traditional fisheries, they can also be caught by hand by diving. In the commercial fishery, there's pretty much only one type of pot is used. It's made predominantly out of wooden battens, and it's baited with fish and let to soak at least 24 hours. And the lobsters walk into the pot overnight and are there to capture in the morning.
Wow, so the lobsters just walk straight on into those pots?
Well, the pots have, they've got sort of angled sides, and the lobsters are used to climbing over reefs, so they find it pretty easy. But what is interesting is that of all the lobsters that sort of encounter a pot during the night when they're feeding, only about 14% are in the pot the next morning. All the rest are getting in and out throughout the night.
Right. So and inside the pot, there's bait, I'm assuming. So the lobster can smell out the bait, and then that's how they crawl into those pots?
Yeah, the bait's kept in a bait basket, so they can't actually get to it all that easily. So the idea being the bait attracts them into the pot, they jump on top of the bait basket, and they can pull out only tiny little bits. So it keeps them in the pot and hanging around for when the pots are pulled the next day.
Awesome. And what actually do lobsters eat? What do they eat themselves?
They're quite amazing. They're very omnivorous. They'll eat almost anything that's available. So when we've looked at their natural diets in the wild, we've found they'll eat, they like polychaete worms in the sediment. They like little shells like cockles, and little gastropods like little marine snails. But anything up to a dead fish on the sea floor, they'll go to that. Anything really.
Right, so they're kind of like scavengers of the bottom of the sea floor. I like it. All right, students, we are going to go to a poll, and I want to know, have you ever eaten a lobster, cooked a lobster, caught a lobster, or none of the above? We want to know what you have done at home. Lobsters seem super, super interesting. What's your favourite fact, Simon, about lobsters?
Oh, my favourite fact. I like the fact that their reproductive cycle is very interesting, and that when the males and females mate, the males leave a sperm packet with the females, and then the female can choose to use that whenever she wants. She can walk around for another couple of months, and only when the conditions are right and she feels like doing it, she can fertilize her own eggs and have babies.
Wow, that's interesting. So, and also, is this right that the female lobster actually holds all of the eggs on the bottom side of her tail, and she may have up to 1 million eggs?
Yeah, very, very big lobsters will be getting close to 1 million eggs. But yeah, she holds them under her tail, and she fans fresh seawater across them constantly for 6 to 8 weeks, letting the eggs slowly develop, and looks after them that way.
Wow, that's really incredible. So she's just walking around with her eggs stuck to her tail. Now we're getting some of the results in. I've seen quite a few of you have eaten a lobster. Some have cooked a lobster. No one has ever caught a lobster though. That's interesting. You can go to menti.com and use the code above 9005 5764 to let us know if you've ever eaten, cooked, caught, or had nothing to do with lobsters before. Now, with the lobsters in Western Australia, how many species of lobster are in Western Australia, Simon?
We've got 8 species. There's probably a few more, but they're the common ones we see. We have southern rock lobsters, which are predominantly found along the south coast below Augusta. And then along the west coast, we have the western rock lobster, which is the dominant species. And then we move into the tropical species, such as the ornate rock lobster and the green rock lobster in the north.
Right, so we've got a lot of different species of lobster. And is it true, because I've heard lobsters being called different names, sometimes I've heard them being called crayfish. Is a crayfish the same as a lobster?
Absolutely. The crayfish is a common name used throughout Australia, and it derives, we think, from crawfish or clawfish, which is applied to the spiny rock lobsters. But as they don't have claws, it's not really an appropriate name. It's actually the proper common name for the freshwater crayfish we get in Australia, like the yabby and the marron and the kunak and the jilgi. And there are actually a couple of marine crayfish, true crayfish, that are found in deep water, but they're not caught very often.
Unreal. Well, thanks, Simon. I'm going to pop over to Chef Analiese and ask her a couple of questions, and then we'll all come back. Now, Analiese, lobster and crayfish all around the world are usually brown or green. It's only when they're exposed to light or heat that a chemical change occurs in their body, causing them to turn red, usually before they're eaten by us. Now, Analiese, can you tell us a little bit about how lobster changes when it's cooked?
Yeah, definitely. So also just a funny fact that I noticed, like in Tasmania at the moment, you can buy lobsters from the docks, and the fishermen were telling me that the ones that are close to the surface are like more red, like they're a different color to the really deep water ones that you get. I don't know if it's the same in WA, and that's before they're cooked. But so when they're cooked, they release a compound called, is it astaxanthin? Is that how you pronounce it? Anyway, it's compounds that that's what makes them red, and it's the same thing that interestingly makes flamingos pink because they eat shrimp and crabs and things, and is the same compound that's in the flesh of salmon that makes it orange as well. So when you cook a lobster, like same with all proteins, like the protein denatures and that changes the texture of the flesh. I know that like raw lobster can be a really, confronting texture for a lot of people. Personally, I quite like it. I'm a fan of the lobster carpaccio or lobster tartare, but most people like it when it's cooked. So normally my favorite way to cook them is just in seawater. So you get a pot of seawater and bring it up, and the rule is generally like 1 minute per 100 grams, because people are always like, we don't know how to cook crayfish. How do we do this? How do we cook it well? It's a bit of a big thing to cook at home, I suppose.
Yeah, right. So what's your favorite way to cook a lobster, Analiese?
Light a fire next to the sea, bring a pot of seawater to the boil, and then just put it in. So for 1 kilo lobster, normally about 10 minutes. And
unreal. So you just cook them?
Yeah.
You cook them right next to the ocean, huh?
Yeah, if I can. I cook on an island sometimes called Satellite Island, like a small island off Tasmania. And yeah, light a wood fire, put a pot of seawater on it, and then just cook them there.
And Analiese, the way that the lobsters are caught in the commercial fishery with those pots, are you catching your lobsters the same way? How do you actually catch yours?
So I do dive, I'm an amateur free diver, but I've never managed to get one free diving only in pots, but I have seen them. The thing is that the lobsters, when they're in the ocean, so they like to go into like the dark crevices and caves, which are places that I don't really like to go into when I'm under the water because I get scared and get stuck in them. So any like dark, deep crevices, and that's when I've discovered that using a torch underwater is actually a really handy tool. I used to not understand why divers had torches, and now I totally get it.
So you're using the torch underwater to catch your lobster. That's really clever.
Yep, exactly. And they kind of like go back into the crevices, and you have to be really fast to get them because they move pretty quickly.
All right, Simon, is a yabby the same as a lobster?
No, a yabby is a freshwater crayfish, and wouldn't last very long out in the ocean. And a spiny rock lobster is a marine animal, and it wouldn't last very long in a freshwater dam either. So, no, very different animals.
Right. So one's essentially freshwater and one's saltwater.
Yep. And you can tell the difference because the yabby has claws, or chelipeds as they're known as, and a spiny rock lobster has none.
Ah, interesting. And what about the difference between, or is there a difference between lobsters in Tasmania and the rest of the world, or Western Australia and the rest of the world?
So the lobsters in Tasmania are considered possibly the best spiny rock lobsters in the world. They come from cold water. Now they're caught in Tasmania, in Victoria, South Australia, and the south coast of Western Australia, as well as New Zealand. Whereas the main species over here in Western Australia, the Western rock lobster, is only found in Western Australia.
Right. So, Analiese, that's pretty good for you. It looks like you've got the tastiest, best looking lobsters down your way to catch.
I know, but now I'm like, how is this Western Australian rock lobster different? I want to know.
Yeah, I wonder if they taste different. That's a good, that's something for you to try.
Well, people have certainly, because we get both species here, have eaten them side by side. And I guess the general description is that the southern rock lobster, the one found in Tasmania, tastes a little bit stronger. It's a stronger flavour and a nicer flavour than the Western. But I guess it comes down to people's personal preferences.
Absolutely. Well, Analiese, a good question around seafood is that sometimes we waste a lot of seafood, and there's parts of our seafood that we could actually cook and use and utilize. What do you do with things like the lobster's eyes or other connected parts that maybe we aren't used to eating? Is there anything that you do with them?
Well, not the eyes specifically, but I have some Tasmanian friends that are lobster fishermen, and they tend to just like eat the tail and then just throw the rest of it away. And one of them came over and brought a lobster to my house one day, and I was like, okay, so we had the tail for dinner, and then the next morning he was like, what are we having for breakfast? And I was like, well, you're going to crack all of the claws, like all of the legs, because there's meat inside all of those, and you get a little like a crab pick and like open the carapace and like pick out all of the meat, and there's a whole nother meal inside there. It's just about being able to access it. So I really enjoy teaching people how to do that and how to open that up.
Absolutely. So essentially, a lot of us are wasting some of the lobster meat that we could actually be eating.
Yeah, I'd say there's about a third of the tail again inside the head and the legs. It's just a matter of like, it takes a little bit more effort to get that meat out, but it's definitely worth it. And then you can make a stock or like, like a bisque or something from the shell and the rest of the head.
Unreal. There's so many things to do with lobsters, huh? Simon, why are some of the lobsters in Western Australia carnivores, but the painted crayfish in Queensland are vegetarian? Have you got any ideas?
Yes, I do. I like this question. The simple answer is all lobsters are omnivorous. There are no lobsters that are vegetarian. The unusual thing about the painted lobster in Queensland, and it goes for a number of species that we have here in Western Australia, is that they actually don't like folding their antennae back. So they're just as attracted to the bait in a pot, but they won't enter a pot because they don't want to put their antennae folded up. It's actually quite unique that lobsters do like to fold their antennae up. It's only the southern rock and the western and a few other species do that.
Right, so the painted cray doesn't fold its antennae up, so it essentially can't or doesn't want to get into the pot.
Exactly, yep.
Wow, it's
so
kind of smart on there.
Sorry to interject, but how do they catch them then if they can't put them in pots?
So the most fisheries for tropical lobsters are either trawl-based, so they use a net similar to a prawn trawling net when the animals are moving across softer habitats, or they're all diver-based, which is the main Torres Strait Islander fishery.
Yeah, interesting. Well, okay, we have a question from some of our students. How many on average lobsters do we find in a pot?
Well, that depends on where you're fishing and which fishery. So in Western Australia, our fishery is extremely healthy. And at the moment, the average number of lobsters coming up in a pot is about 15 lobsters.
Oh.
Yep. Whereas if you go to other fisheries around the world, you may be getting, some. I know, for example, in Florida, where they catch a very similar lobster, there are so many pots put in the water that some pots never see a lobster for the entire year.
Wow. So it just really depends on where you're trying to catch the lobster and I guess the season as well, and if the lobsters are even there.
Absolutely.
Right. I also heard a fact, Simon, that when the lobsters are young, only around 2 out of a potential 1 million of the eggs will turn into an adult. Is that true?
Well, I don't know exactly on the numbers because it's very hard to work out, but it's a pretty tough life being a lobster. When a female releases her eggs, these eggs hatch into a baby lobster called a phylosoma, and they in the Western rock lobster fishery, these phylosoma float around in the ocean for 9 to 11 months. Now, in Tasmania, they actually float around for 2 years. At the whim of the currents, then they somehow have to get back to shore, metamorphose into a baby lobster, and then dodge all the fish and the octopus and all the other animals that eat them. So it certainly is, it's quite a rare event, I think, for an animal a lobster to get all the way through back to an adult. That's why they release
Right, and
so many.
Yeah, so it makes sense. Lots and lots of eggs to try and get it to an adult. But so Bodhi has asked us a question. How big do lobsters actually grow?
Well, again, it depends on the species and actually, quite interestingly, the location. So the Western rock lobster grows to about, I'd say 3 kilos. So, and which is quite big, quite long. The Southern rock lobster actually grows a fair bit bigger. And I think in the warmer waters around Tasmania is where you get your biggest ones. And they can be quite massive.
All right. Analiese, what's the biggest lobster you've found?
I cooked one from Flinders Island last week and it was 3.8 kilos.
Wow, big lobster.
It was really big. It wouldn't fit in anything in my kitchen at home. Wouldn't fit in the pot, wouldn't fit in the tray.
With your hands, can you show us how big you think it was?
Whoa.
Whoa.
About that big?
That's huge.
It was a beast.
That is. I've got another question here. How long do lobsters live for?
Well, we've caught some babies a long time ago and kept them alive in the aquarium here at the department, and they live for 26 years almost.
Wow, that's incredible.
So the tricky thing with lobsters is we can't actually age them accurately yet. With fish, we can look at their ear bones and they lay down rings the same as a tree lays down rings, and so we can age the fish. But there is actually no good technique of doing that in crustaceans. So only really from keeping them alive in the aquarium or from putting a little tag on the lobster and then recapturing them sometime later can we get some idea of their age. But it's certainly, getting up there over 20 years, definitely.
Wow, that's amazing. Now, Analiese, have you ever cooked another animal that has changed colour when you've cooked it?
Oh, good question. Crabs, definitely.
Crabs? Yeah.
Yeah.
What sort of colour do they change?
Same thing. Yeah, same thing as lobsters. They go red. The shell turns red when they're cooked. Definitely prawns as well. They're kind of like a blue, like muddy green grey color. They turn red when cooked as well. They're the main ones that spring to mind.
Unreal. And I've got a question here from Rowan. He has asked, how do you know where to put your lobster pots and how to catch the lobsters?
That's a great question.
For me or Simon?
Anyone that wants to answer.
Well, I can start. And again, I guess it depends where and what species. In Western Australia, our animal is actually quite unique in that they spend most of their life living on a reef in caves, as Analiese was describing, using the torch to see them at the back of caves. So at the right time of the year, which is every month except essentially December, you would want to put your pots right next to a cave on the reef if you can. Now, in December, everything changes here. And all the juvenile lobsters, so those that are just about to become teenagers, if you will, they walk from all the shallow nursery habitats across sand to deep water. And that time of the year, if you put your pots on the reef, you catch nothing. But if you put them on the sand, you catch hundreds of lobsters. So it depends on the time.
Excellent. So they go on a migration journey across from the reef to the sand. That's really interesting.
Yeah, kind of from reef to reef across sand. So that they go from shallow water out to about 80 meters in depth onto the offshore reefs, where they'll then become adults and start the reproductive cycle all over again.
All right, well, I've got time for a couple more questions. And this one, in the water, when they are in the shallows and exposed to the sun, does their shell change color? And I think, Analiese, you kind of touched on this before, that you saw that some of the lobsters that were in the shallow water were actually starting to turn red already.
That is what the crayfisherman told me down at the dock. Simon, can you confirm that that's the truth?
Yeah, I can. And so I know within the Tasmanian lobsters, it's in the really deep water in the south that they're a lot paler. And this actually has a lot to do with their diet. And we see it here in Western Australia. It's very clever by the lobster, actually. If they're living in an environment where there's a lot of red algae and sort of their dark colours around them, they're eating bits of red algae and snails that are grazing on the red algae, and they go a lot darker, deeper red themselves. But if they're living in spongy corally habitats, and there's not a lot of that red algae around, and it's a brighter environment, their shells actually are paler because it's just they're eating a different diet so that they look more like where they live and predators can't find them as easily.
Oh, wow, that's really smart. So they camouflage based off what they eat. Unreal.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Analiese, apart from humans, do you know what else eats lobsters?
Oh, octopus. Octopus definitely eat lobsters. Yeah, I've seen this. I've seen them try to get lobsters out of pots.
Very interesting. Simon, anything else that eats lobsters?
Pretty much everything in the ocean that eats meat eats lobsters if it can get hold of a lobster. So as you mentioned at the very start, sea lions, they love a lobster. Sharks and rays and your big demersal fish like snapper, they also love a lobster if they can find one.
All right, and we'll finish up with a couple more questions. Are lobsters as old as dinosaurs? How long have lobsters been around for?
That's a tough one. I know that there are some fossils that show they have been around for a long time in slightly different forms. Not exactly the same as the spiny lobsters now, but they are quite an ancient species.
Okay, so pretty old, the lobsters. And lastly, is the lobster industry a sustainable fishery? Is it safe and healthy? And are we doing the right thing to protect our lobsters, but also eat them at the same time?
I know that it is WA.
Sorry?
It is definitely in Western Australia.
Yeah, and I think most of the fisheries, in fact, all of the lobster fisheries I know of around Australia are extremely well managed and would have to be the most sustainable lobster fisheries in the world. Australia really does set the standards for sustainability.
Excellent. Well, I'm so glad to hear that Australia is doing so well looking after our beautiful rock lobsters, and that we can actually see them in the wild, catch them, eat them, and be sustainable with that species, with all the species of crayfish and lobsters as well. Thank you so much, Simon and Analiese, for all of your great knowledge on lobsters and the Australian lobster industry. And I'm going to throw back over to Alexis.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to our guest speakers today, Analiese and Simon. And thank you to all of you who wrote in with your wonderful science questions. We received a lot. This event was hosted today by the Marine Stewardship Council's education program, Saltwater Schools. And if you'd like to learn more about our oceans and sustainable fishing and food for the future, we have lots of free resources and lesson plans over at our website, www.msc.org/saltwaterschools. We'll be holding another Q&A session this Wednesday, 18th of August at 1:30 p.m. Sydney time, 11:30 in Western Australia, on the subject of Follow the Fish, where we'll learn about tuna and the journey of our fish from the boat to the plate. Thanks all, and see you next time.